They were only 7 years old, two little sisters, twins bound by the same breath of life, too weak even to raise their voices in a cry. The late chill of Silverwood Park clung to them like an unwelcome shroud, making their small bodies tremble against the hard ground. Anyone passing by might have walked on without noticing, blind to their silent suffering. But it wasn't a passerby who found them. It was a German shepherd, a dog bred for duty, yet driven by something deeper, an instinct that refused to let him ignore their pain. His ears lifted, tail stiff, body tense. He would not leave, and because of him, an officer came closer. What was uncovered in that quiet corner of the park was more than just the misery of two children. It was a wound, raw and deep, a story no child should ever carry. But let this not be heard as only a tale of suffering. It is also a tale of courage, of strength found in fragile bodies, of love that emerged in the unlikeliest of places, and of freedom, hard-won and dearly kept. Stay with it until the very end, and may the blessings of justice and protection fall not only upon these children, but also upon you who listen with an open heart. Silverwood Park on that evening wore the slow weight of late autumn as though it were a crown, simple but solemn. The maples stood like quiet sentinels, their leaves burnished copper. The oaks gleamed with the dull glow of brass, and the pond reflected the fading day like a cracked mirror, darkening with the shadows of migrating geese stitching the sky. The air whispered through the grass, combing it in shivers. Twilight had begun its slow descent, that strange hour when light seems unsure which way to lean, toward day or toward night. On the far stretch of the lawn, movement broke the stillness. A German shepherd glided across the ground like a shadow that had been given muscle and purpose. His name was Shadow. 5 years into his service, his body carved strong and sure, sable fur touched with black, chest wide as an anvil, eyes burning amber like honey warmed by fire. His steps were steady, but his every pause, every turn of his head spoke of alertness. He pulled just slightly ahead of the man holding his lead, stopping, testing the air, then tugging forward with sudden certainty. "Easy," said Officer Ethan Walker, lengthening his stride to match the dog's pull. At 36, he carried himself with the weight of both his years and his duty. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in his dark navy jacket, Ethan had the build of a man meant to fill doorways and walk long roads. His haircut was close, practical. His face was cut in square lines, softened only by the stubble of the day, and the quiet steadiness in his gray-blue eyes, the shade of rivers running beneath slate skies. He wasn't known for dramatics. People in town said he was kind without being soft, decisive without needing to raise his voice. Under his shirt, a thin cord carried a plain gold ring, a promise, heavy as a stone, a memory of the wife he had lost too early. Widowhood had taught him to live with silence, to read what others never said as clearly as what they spoke. Shadow froze. His nostrils quivered. He barked, short, sharp, urgent, again and again like a fist knocking at a locked door. The officer's gaze followed the dog's line to the base of an old white oak. Its roots rose twisted and thick, like knuckles reaching up through the earth. There, nestled between them, lay the figures. 2 little girls, no more than 7. Huddled like birds caught in a storm. They curled into themselves, trying to vanish from the cold, from the world. Ethan's chest tightened. They looked like shadows of children, worn thin by too many hard days. Their hair, once brushed smooth, now tangled with leaves and dirt, soft honey-brown strands catching the last light. Their cheeks were pale, streaked with the dust of the park. The older of the two, you could tell by a tilt of the chin, curled protectively around her stomach, her breaths sharp and shallow. The younger pressed both her hands against her middle, a child's small and desperate attempt to hold back pain that refused to stop. Their clothes told the rest, once clean, now threadbare. A pink cardigan missing its top button. A gray sweater stretched thin at the sleeves. Jeans rubbed white at the knees. They carried the smell of cold nights and stale bread, and beneath that, a sharper chemical tang that clawed at the back of Ethan's throat. Shadow circled them once, deliberate, nails clicking gently against the roots. Then he lowered himself and sat, a trained signal that spoke louder than words. Here. This is where the truth waits. Ethan dropped to one knee, lowering his voice to a tone as warm and steady as he could make it, the voice one uses with nervous animals and frightened children. "Hey there," he said softly. "My name's Ethan. This is Shadow. Can you tell me your names?" The older girl blinked, eyes hazel with green flecks trembling at the edge, her lips parted, the sound barely a thread of air. "Ivy," she whispered. Then her eyes fluttered shut again, one arm tight across her belly. The younger lifted her head, her face rounder though carved by pain. "Ren," she said, her lip trembling as she tried, so bravely, so childishly, to give a smile as though to prove she could still be strong in front of strangers. "Good," Ethan murmured, his eyes scanning quickly, careful not to alarm them. No obvious bleeding, no broken bones, but their bodies spoke in flinches, in protective curls. Something deeper, hidden, he would not press yet. Questions can wound worse than answers if asked too soon. He turned his radio on. "Dispatch Walker, in Silverwood Park, north side by the old oak. I've got 2 minors, female, about 7 years old. Conscious, but showing severe abdominal distress. Possible dehydration. Request EMS, code 2. Upgrade if condition declines." Static answered. Then a calm voice. "Copy. Units en route." Shadow pressed his nose gently against Ren's wrist. She flinched first, then slowly relaxed, her tiny hand curling into the ruff of his fur. He stayed, solid and warm, a living shield against the cold world. "Officer." The word came from the path. Ethan turned to see a thin figure approaching, wrapped in a navy windbreaker, his breath fogged, the air with each step. He looked to be in his 70s, careful in his pace but determined. Good shoes finding sure ground. Wisps of silver hair peeked from beneath his cap, and his face carried both easy smiles and quiet worries, as though both were habits he could not break. "Name's Albert Whittam," he said, stopping with a hand pressed against his ribs. "Retired. Postman. I walk here most mornings. Saw these little ones at sunrise. Thought they were just playing at first, but they didn't move much. Came back later. They looked worse." Ethan gave a small nod. A witness, and more importantly, a kind soul. "Thank you, Mr. Whittam. Did you see anyone with them? Hear anything unusual?" The old man frowned, glancing toward the service road. "No adults, but there was a black sedan on Maple Street. Sat there idling a long time. Might be nothing. I didn't want to scare the girls. Should I get blankets from my car?" "Please," Ethan said, "and wait where EMS can see you. Wave them in." Mr. Whittam moved off quickly, arms pumping as though the mailbags of his past had returned to his shoulders. Ethan pulled off his jacket, laying it gently across the twins, splitting its warmth between them. He checked their pulses. Fast. Their skin. Cold. Ren's breaths came in small, hitching gasps. He resisted the instinct to offer water. Not with this kind of pain. Warmth, not risk. That was the answer now. "We'll get you safe," he murmured. "You've been so brave, staying together, that's the bravest thing of all." Ivy's eyes opened just a sliver. We didn't want to go back," she whispered. "Back? Where?" Ethan asked gently. But Ivy had already retreated, folding back into silence, a silence that locked its own doors. Shadow shifted closer, body angled like a guard, his fur rising slightly as the wind turned sharp. On the drive, a jogger. Slowed, pulled out an earbud, saw, understood, and quietly veered away. At dusk, the park was a village. People knew when to help and when to give space. Ethan's radio cracked again. "Walker, EMS 5 minutes out." He looked at the girls, then at the steady, unmoving dog. "I'm going to carry you to my cruiser. It's warmer there. Ivy, may I pick you up first?" She nodded, jaw tight with pain. He lifted her carefully, furious at the nothingness of her weight. Children should never feel this light. He set her gently in the back of his cruiser, the heater humming like a small stove. Shadow leapt in beside her without command, pressing himself against her legs, anchoring her with warmth and weight. "Your turn, Wren," Ethan said, returning to the oak. Her lashes sparkled with the start of tears, but she gave a small nod, solemn and steady. He lifted her, felt her breath flutter faint against his collar, then placed her beside her sister. Wren's hand reached blindly, found Ivy's, and their fingers wove together the simplest and most powerful magic in the world. "Officer Walker." Mr. Whittam reappeared, hurrying with surprising speed, 2 plaid blankets clutched in his hands. "Found these in the trunk, clean enough, I promise." "Perfect," Ethan said. He wrapped the blankets over the girls' legs, then another across their shoulders, a small fortress of warmth. "You hang on, little birds," Mr. Whittam said, gently, leaning in with a grandfather's smile. "Park's no place for hungry bellies, help's almost here." Wren shivered once, then steadied. Ivy squeezed the old man's hand, then let go. From blocks away, the siren rose and fell, weaving into the low moan of the wind in the trees. Ethan checked the twins again, breaths shallow, pulses racing, eyes drifting in and out. He filed away every detail: the chemical scent, the frayed cardigans, the hair ties too neat for chance. These were clues. Later, when others asked questions, when this night became a story to retell, these pieces would matter. Shadow lifted his head, ears forward, not in fear, but in sure acknowledgement. He laid his muzzle on Ivy's knees, exhaling. She mirrored. "Him, shoulders loosening just a little. Walker," a voice came through his radio again. "Unit 12 here. You good for a second car?" Ethan pressed the button. "Affirmative. I've got them stable in my cruiser. We'll transfer to EMS when they arrive." He looked down the lane, where flashing lights would soon appear, and felt that familiar knot of dread and hope tightening in his chest. Between finding and saving, there is always a waiting minute. A minute survived only with training, or with prayer, or with both. Across town, a phone buzzed on a desk scattered with notebooks, and a coffee cup ringed with old stains. Linda Parker, reporter for the Silverwood Chronicle, dug her scanner out from a pile of city agendas. She was 28, her auburn hair pulled up in a messy bun, her grin quick but rarely trusted, her skepticism worn like armor. Brash, perhaps, but only because she cared too much. The scanner crackled. 2 minors, abdominal distress, Silverwood Park. Linda's pen was already in her hand before she knew it. She'd reached for it. Her Subaru's passenger seat was already a nest of maps and camera lenses. "Okay," she said to no one, flicking on the heater and talking around a mouthful of cold granola bar. "Let's see what the wind is bringing in today." Back at the park, the ambulance rounded the curve, lights splashing red and white across oaks and benches. Mr. Wickham stepped into the lane, windbreaker flapping, to flag them toward the cruiser. Shadow's tail made a single slow arc, acknowledgement more than excitement. The world was moving. Ethan leaned into the back seat one more time. "Hear that?" he asked softly. "That sound is for you." Ivy's lids trembled. Wren's fingers tightened around her sister's. The dog's breath warmed the blankets, steady as tide. When the paramedics climbed out with their kits, Ethan stepped aside to make room. One hand on the cruiser's door, one eye on his partner. Shadow didn't budge from the girl's legs. He watched the medics with the thoughtful stillness of a sentry. Ethan made the call to the hospital from the curb, voice trimmed to its professional edge. He glanced through the glass at Ivy and Wren, huddled together, then at the shepherd, whose eyes never left them. "We've got you," he said under his breath. To the girls, the dog, the trees, and maybe Toe himself. "We've got you." The wail of the ambulance siren melted into the background hum of the town as it carried the two girls through the streets of Silverwood. The sky had deepened to bruised violet, and the street lamps flickered alive, catching on the wet sheen of pavement after a light drizzle. Ethan Walker followed close behind in his cruiser, Shadow seated upright in the back seat. The shepherd's amber eyes never wavered from the red lights ahead, as though he understood that the fate of the two children was tethered to that rushing vehicle. At Silverwood Regional Hospital, the emergency entrance glowed sterile white. Nurses wheeled the twins inside, their small bodies swallowed in oversized blankets. Ethan pulled up seconds later, boots striking briskly against the linoleum as he entered, Shadow heeling at his side. He kept a steady hand on the leash, but the dog's muscles quivered, ears flicking at every sound. Inside the treatment room, a doctor, in a crisp white coat, was already donning gloves. Dr. Clara Monroe was in her early 40s, tall and lean, her sandy blonde hair tied back in a non-nonsense ponytail. She had a poised, almost austere presence, softened only by eyes of calm hazel that could disarm fear in a heartbeat. Known among her colleagues for her precision, she had built a reputation for balancing medical rigor with compassion. "Vitals are unstable," a nurse reported as she handed over the chart. Dr. Monroe's gaze swept over the girls. She crouched beside Ivy first, peeling back the blanket with the delicate care of someone handling fragile porcelain. "Abdomen distended, tenderness on palpation," she murmured, pressing gently. Ivy flinched hard, a soft cry slipping out before she clamped her lips. Clara frowned. She moved to Wren, noting the same protective curl, the same flinch. Ethan stood at the doorway, jaw tightening. "What are we looking at, doctor?" Clara removed her gloves, tossed them into the bin with clinical precision. Signs of prolonged malnutrition, possibly gastrointestinal damage. Their stomachs have been pushed past their limits. They've been eating, or rather forced to eat, something they shouldn't, likely spoiled or contaminated food. Shadow gave a low growl, almost like agreement. Ethan crouched to steady him, but his own mind sharpened, piecing together the fragments he'd seen in the park. The faint chemical scent on their clothes, the brittle way they moved, the whispers about not wanting to go back. As the medical team busied themselves, Clara gently lifted Evie's arm to insert an IV. Under the fluorescent light, the underside of the child's wrist told its own story. Faint red marks encircling the skin, the ghost of bindings worn too long. Clara's mouth hardened into a grim line. She looked up at Ethan. "See here? Those are not playground scrapes. These are impressions from restraints, rope or leather, old but recurrent." Ethan leaned in, eyes narrowing. Eyes. And both girls have the same. "Yes," Clara said flatly. "This isn't random." The room held a silence heavy with realization. The monitors beeped steadily, filling in the space. Words could not. In the corridor outside, hurried footsteps approached. A voice, brisk and edged with curiosity, slipped through before its owner did. Linda Parker, the local reporter, entered with her notebook clutched tight, auburn hair pulled back into a messy bun. She wore a navy pica coat that had seen too many late nights, her pen poised like a weapon of truth. Her green eyes, sharp and restless, flicked from the children on the beds to Ethan at the door. "I caught the dispatch on my scanner," she said without apology. Two miners collapsed in the park. People are going to want answers. Officer Walker, can you comment? Ethan's brow furrowed. Not now, Linda. His voice carried the tone of a man used to drawing lines. Linda stepped closer anyway, lowering her tone. I'm not looking for gossip, but the public deserves to know if children are being hurt in this town. Who are they? Where are their parents? Why would they be starving in Silverwood of all places? Before Ethan could answer, Clara spoke. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of authority that even journalists rarely challenged. Reporter or not, you'll wait until these children are stabilized. They are patients first, headline second. Linda blinked, then gave a small nod. She flipped her notebook shut, tucking it under her arm, but her eyes didn't leave the twins. Compassion flickered there, softening the usual edge. Just let me know when I can help. People need to be watching. Secrets don't stay secrets forever. A nurse entered with a tray of food samples from the cafeteria intended to test the girl's tolerance for solids. She was a woman in her 30s, hair neatly plaited, her badge reading Nurse Dana Lopez. She had a round face framed by wire rim glasses and an air of quiet diligence. She sat down 2 bowls of bland oatmeal, steam curling up. They should try a few. Bites, Dana said gently. See if their stomachs can handle it. The girl sat propped on the bed, Ivy's taped to their arms. Ivy looked at the bowl as though it were a stranger. Wren's eyes widened, her small hands gripping the blanket tightly. Neither reached for the spoon. Dana crouched, spoon poised with a careful scoop. Sweethearts, just a taste. It'll help. But both children shrank back. Ivy whispered, We can't. Please, we can't. Ethan stepped forward, voice steady but low. Why not? No answer. Just the way their eyes fixed on the bowls, wide with a fear too practiced for children. Nurse Dana glanced at Ethan, lowering her voice. This isn't normal. Kids their age usually leap at food when they're hungry. They're terrified of eating. It's as if they were punished with it, instead of comforted by it. Ethan felt the words strike like a cold knife, punished with food. The idea lodged in his mind, unwanted but immovable. He glanced at Shadow, who sat rigid at the doorway, eyes locked on the girls, ears tipped forward as if he understood every unsaid truth. Clara returned with test results, her expression grim, electrolytes dangerously low, clear signs of chronic undernourishment. They've been living this way for weeks, maybe months. She hesitated before adding, If someone's responsible, we're not just dealing with neglect. We're looking at intentional harm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent. Ethan folded his arms, shoulders tense beneath his jacket. He had seen crime before, cruelty in many shapes. But the sight of 2 fragile lives curled against hospital pillows carried a particular weight. They weren't just victims. They were evidence of a secret threaded through the quiet streets of Silverwood. Linda scribbled a quick note. Even though she'd promised to wait, she couldn't help herself. Her journalist's instincts told her a storm was coming. Ethan caught the motion but said nothing. Part of him knew she might become an ally when the truth grew too heavy for official reports alone. As the evening deepened into night, the hospital grew quieter. Ivy and Wren finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, their hands clasped together over the blanket. Shadow padded silently to their bedside and curled into a sphinx-like posture, chest rising and falling in rhythm with theirs, as if syncing his heartbeat to theirs. Ethan lingered near the door, his eyes shadowed but unyielding. Something inside him whispered that this was only the beginning, and that the worst truth still lay hidden in a house not far from here. The hospital's quiet hours settled over Silverwood Regional like a heavy quilt. The lights dimmed in the pediatric wing, and the hum of machines filled the spaces where words were absent. Ivy and Wren slept side by side in the narrow beds, their small hands still entwined even in unconsciousness. Shadow lay between them on the floor, chest rising in steady rhythm, his amber eyes half closed but always alert. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, his uniform jacket draped across a chair. Fatigue pressed at his shoulders, but his mind refused to rest. Near midnight, Wren stirred. Her body twitched and her face twisted into the mask of some unseen terror. A faint whimper escaped her lips, followed by words in the fragile voice of a dream. Don't make us drink it again. Please, not the water, not the burning water." The words stabbed the silence. Ethan straightened instantly, every muscle taut. He glanced at Ivy, still asleep, her breathing uneven but calm. Then back to Wren, whose small frame shook as though caught in a fever. He crossed to her bed and gently brushed the damp hair from her forehead. "It's just a dream," he murmured. "You're safe now." But Shadow was no longer calm. His head jerked up, ears flat against his skull. With a sharp whine, he pressed his nose against the bundle of clothing folded at the end of Wren's bed. Her sweater and shirt, the only belongings carried from the park. The shepherd's nostrils flared. Then he recoiled with a growl, pacing tight circles. Ethan frowned. He picked up the sweater and lifted it to his own face. A pungent, acrid odor clung to the fabric, faint but unmistakable. The stinging chemical bite of chlorine. Bleach. Something no child's clothes should carry. His jaw tightened. Wren's dream words, Shadow's reaction, the smell. It all fit together, into something worse than he dared to consider. He whispered to himself. They were forced. Forced to drink something toxic. The thought made his stomach knot. This wasn't mere neglect. It was punishment by poison. Shadow barked once, low but insistent, as if confirming the suspicion. Ethan placed a steadying hand on the dog's head, though. His own pulse was racing. The door creaked softly as a nurse peeked in, checking vitals. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark curly hair tied back and tired eyes that still held warmth. Her badge read, Sophie Tran. She adjusted the IV drips, her movements quiet. "She's dreaming again?" Sophie asked softly. "Yes," Ethan replied. "And not just a dream. She's remembering." He held up the sweater. "Do you smell that?" Sophie leaned closer, nose wrinkling instantly. "Bleach," she said grimly. "Why would that be on a child's clothing?" Ethan didn't answer. The truth already clawed at him. He knew too well that cruelty often masqueraded as discipline in people who demanded control above all. While the twins rested, Linda Parker pursued her own trail. Across town, she pulled her coat tighter against the sharp night air, notebook in hand. Her boots echoed faintly along Maple Street, where tidy homes stood in neat rows, their porches draped in late autumn garlands. The only house without decoration loomed at the far end, a pale brick structure with shuttered windows and a yard too manicured to feel alive. She wrote its address, Gregory Hale, 119 Maple End. Earlier, Linda had spoken with neighbors during the fading light. One woman in her 60s, bundled in a wool shawl, lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "That man, he lives alone since his wife passed. He walks a dog sometimes, a big one, but I've never once seen him smile. And the way he looks at people, like measuring them, not meeting them." Linda jotted notes furiously. Another neighbor, a man, repairing his mailbox, added, "Strangest thing. Every week delivery trucks drop off heavy boxes at his door, cleaning supplies, gallons of bleach. I don't know what he does with it all. His house isn't exactly sparkling." The most telling account came from the corner shop owner, Mrs. Ruth Delgado, a stocky woman in her 50s with hair pinned tightly in a bun. She spoke with the bluntness of someone who had nothing to hide. "Hale buys bleach like it's milk. Cases of it. I asked once, joking if he was running a laundromat. He just stared at me until I wished I hadn't said a word. And his house floor is still grimy. The stuff isn't for cleaning if you ask me." Linda's pulse quickened as she scribbled every word. Her instincts screamed connection. Children arriving at the hospital with chemical traces on their clothes, neighbors describing a man obsessed with bleach. These weren't loose coincidences. They were threads pulling toward the same dark knot. She stood outside Hale's home for a long moment, watching the blank facade. Curtains hung stiff. No sound escaped, yet the air around the place felt weighted. She lifted her camera, snapped a single photo of the house under lamplight, then retreated, before suspicion could catch her. Back at the hospital, Ethan remained beside the twins. Wren had calmed again, her breathing steady. Ivy stirred briefly, muttering something unintelligible before sinking deeper into sleep. Shadow, however, kept his gaze locked on the clothing bundle, tail stiff, body rigid. He knew, even if he could not explain, that danger had clung to these children before safety found them. Ethan sat heavily in the chair by their bed, elbows on knees, his mind circling the same thought. No one forces bleach into a child without believing it's a lesson, which meant there was someone out there in this quiet town who thought torment was training. He swore silently that he would find that person. Outside the hospital window, the wind rattled the bare branches of silver maples. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent as though echoing Shadow's vow. The next morning in Silverwood were a pale and brittle light. Frost clung to the corners of windshields and breath lifted like smoke from early walkers hurrying to work. Ethan Walker guided his cruiser down Maple Street, Shadow pacing silently in the back seat, his head just high enough to peer through the glass. The shepherd's body was tense, muscles coiled as if his instincts already knew what they were about to confront. Maple Street was an odd vein of the town, lined with tidy houses, porches draped in fading pumpkins and garlands, mailboxes freshly painted, but with one address that seemed to reject the season entirely. At the end of the street stood a pale brick house, symmetrical to the point of sterility. No decorations softened its facade. No children's toys littered the yard. No sound of laughter spilled from behind the shutters. The hedges were trimmed square, the lawn clipped short. But the air around the place was heavy, a silence that felt unnatural. Ethan parked halfway down the block. He preferred the walk, the chance to see a place before announcing his presence. As he approached, Shadowseers shot forward, nostrils flaring. The dog stiffened, then released a low, guttural growl that vibrated against the leash. His amber eyes locked on the house's front door as though it radiated danger. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, though his own pulse had begun to climb. He trusted Shadow's instincts too deeply to dismiss them. He paused at the edge of the yard, scanning. A curtain shifted at an upstairs window. A silhouette loomed briefly. A tall man with broad shoulders, dressed even at this hour in a dark suit jacket and pressed white shirt. His hair, black with threads of gray, was combed back neatly, almost militarily so. His face was hard, planes of bone more than flesh. His mouth a thin, unsmiling line. His eyes gray, cold, locked with Ethan's for a fraction of a second. Then the curtain slid shut. Ethan felt that gaze even after it disappeared. It was the look of a man not startled by a police officer outside, his home, but irritated by the intrusion, as if his world should remain untouched by scrutiny. Shadow barked once, sharp and piercing. Across the street, an older woman carrying a grocery bag stopped mid-step. She shifted the sack in her arms and lowered her voice when Ethan glanced her way. "You're watching him too?" she asked, her eyes darting toward the house. Her name, she later introduced, was Martha Green, a widow. In her late 60s with thinning gray hair and a shawl clutched tightly around her narrow frame. "What do you mean, ma'am?" Ethan asked carefully. Martha's lips pressed thin. "I've lived on this street 20 years. Every night long after sunset I hear it. Sharp cracks like leather striking. He tells anyone who asks that he's training a dog. But there's no dog bark, no whimper, nothing, just the sound of punishment. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the grocery bag. I don't believe him. None of us do. Ethan thanked her, his tone gentle, though the words carved deeper into his suspicions. Shadow strained toward the door, hackles raised like a banner. Down the block, another voice joined. Franklin Webb, a retired mechanic with a hunched back and grease-stained cap, leaned on his cane by the mailbox. You'll never see kids knock for candy here on Halloween, he muttered. House is dark, blinds shut tight. I tell you, officer, that man gives me the chills. We hear things. We know something isn't right. Ethan logged every word silently, his gaze fixed on the unblinking windows of the house. Meanwhile, on the opposite sidewalk, Linda Parker crouched behind the open door of her Subaru. Camera lifted. She wore a wool, cap pulled low against the cold, her cheeks pink from the air, eyes sharp with focus. She had followed Ethan here, but from a distance, unwilling to intrude directly. Through her lens, she captured the sterile lines of the house, the curtain drawn, tight after that fleeting glimpse of the man inside. Each click of the shutter felt to her like insurance, a record against denial. She zoomed in, noting the way the driveway was immaculate, not a single oil stain. The windows gleamed too perfectly, as though polished to hide what lay behind. She whispered into her recorder. House of Gregory Hale, Maple Street. Witness accounts. Suggest sounds of violence masked as dog training, heavy chemical deliveries, odd routines, photographing evidence. She pressed send, transmitting the first images back to her editor at the Chronicle. Back in front of the house, Ethan shifted his weight, considering he couldn't knock. Not yet, not without more, but he had seen enough to confirm what his gut already knew. This house was not simply odd, it was dangerous. As he turned to leave, the curtain fluttered once more. Gregory Hale stood there again, the shadow of a man framed by lace. This time his eyes met Ethan's squarely. There was no flicker of surprise, no attempt to conceal, only a sharp, narrow glare, like the edge of a knife. With deliberate slowness, he pinched the curtain closed, blotting out the morning light. Shadow's growl rumbled low in his chest, steady and unbroken. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the tautness of muscle beneath. I saw it too, he whispered. And we're not walking away from this. The street settled into silence once more. But the weight of those eyes lingered long after Ethan guided Shadow back to the cruiser. Somewhere behind the pale bricks of Maple Street, answers waited, hidden, but not forever. The hospital corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled coffee, the kind of air that clung to late hours and tired faces. Dr. Clara Monroe sat at her desk in the pediatric wing, spectacles perched low on her nose as she reviewed her notes. The glow from the desk lamp softened the sharp lines of her face, but her expression was grim. She tapped her pen against the page, then wrote deliberately, the ink biting into the paper. Patient Ivy Walker, age approximately 7, she murmured under her breath as she wrote. Signs of gastrointestinal trauma consistent with repeated ingestion of spoiled or harsh substances. Patient Wren, twin sister, identical symptoms mirrored in severity. Additional evidence, rope-like impressions around wrists, now fading but visible. Both exhibit unusual aversion to food, strongly suggestive of conditioned fear response. She paused, exhaled slowly. She had seen bruises and fractures. Children with broken arms explained away as tumbles downstairs. But this was worse. Poison. In place of food, fear in place of nurture. She snapped the folder shut and slipped it into the locked cabinet, a step toward evidence that could not be ignored. Ethan entered then, Shadow at his side. The shepherd's claws clicked lightly against the tile, his movements taut as if the very air kept him on edge. Clara's gaze softened a fraction. "You've stayed all night," she said. Ethan gave a weary half-smile. "So, Hash." He scratched Shadow's ear absently, though his own face was marked by sleepless lines. "Doctor, your notes. They're enough to open a file." "Yes," Clara replied. "And, more than that, they demand intervention." Moments later, another figure joined them. Emily Grant, the county social worker, stepped through the door with a leather satchel over her shoulder. She was in her mid-30s, slender but sturdy. Her brown hair pulled into a functional braid that brushed her collar. Her clothes were simple, a gray cardigan, sensible flats, but her presence carried weight. There was resolve in her eyes, tempered by the kind of compassion earned from years of fighting silent battles for children. "Ethan," she greeted with a firm handshake, then nodded at Clara. "I've read your preliminary report. If the details hold, we'll open a supervision file and petition for protective custody. These girls won't go back until we know what's happening." Ethan leaned forward, voice low. "You should see for yourself their reactions. It's more than malnutrition. They're terrified." "And Shadow? He reacts every time we bring out anything tied to the house." As if on cue, Ethan produced the folded sweater taken from the park. The chemical tang lingered still. Shadow lunged forward, nose, pressed against the fabric, then recoiled with a guttural snarl. His hackles bristled, amber eyes sharp with a focus that made Emily's stomach turn. "That's not nothing," she whispered. "Dogs don't fake instinct," Clara added firmly. "Between the medical evidence and the behavioral signs, we can't wait for accidents to repeat. These children need safety now." Emily nodded. "I'll begin the paperwork tonight. But Ethan, if this man is who we think, he'll fight back. Men like that always do." Meanwhile, across town, Linda Parker was chasing her own ghost through records that smelled of dust and ink. The Silverwood Chronicle's archive room was cramped, a basement stacked with yellowed boxes and bound ledgers. Linda crouched on the floor, hair falling loose from its bun, glasses sliding down her nose as she flipped through brittle files. She had chased a hunch, following Gregory Hale's name through complaint logs and old letters to the editor. And then she found it. A police report 15 years old filed by a neighbor. Alleged animal cruelty. It read, "Witness testimony claimed Hale had beaten a hunting dog repeatedly with a leather strap. The case was dismissed. Their court marked as settled." Linda's pen flew across her notebook. Settled with money, no doubt. She traced the scrolled signature of the complainant, now long faded, then shut the folder with a sharp thud. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't the first time Gregory Hale had worn cruelty like a second skin. That evening, she called a source she trusted, Arthur Doyle, a retired deputy in his late 70s. Arthur's voice over Thaline was rough, gravel-shaped, by decades of cigarettes, but still steady. "Gregory Hale?" he raised when she asked. "I remember that one. We knew something was off, but the witnesses backed down. Rumor was he paid them enough to keep quiet. I'll tell you this, any man who can hurt a dog won't think twice about hurting a child." Linda thanked him, heart pounding, and began drafting her article in short hand. The town needed to see this. Back at the hospital, Ethan walked the corridor with Emily. They paused outside the twins' room, watching through the glass as Ivy sat hunched in bed. Wren pressed close beside her. A tray of food rested untouched on the table, steam curling from a bowl of soup. An older man shuffled by, a visitor from another room, pausing as he caught sight of the twins. His name tag identified him as Harold Jenkins, age 80, white-haired and bent with a cane. His eyes lingered with quiet sorrow. "I've seen those little ones before," he said softly to Ethan. "You know them?" Ethan asked. "Not their names," Harold admitted. His voice carried the draw of a life lived in one town. "But I saw them once sitting on the front steps of Hale's house, end of Maple Street. Their faces," he shook his head slowly. "They looked like children being punished just for breathing." I thought about asking if they needed help, but his car pulled in, and I walked away. I've regretted it ever since. Ethan's chest tightened. Another piece for the puzzle. Another witness to the shadows inside Hale's walls. He placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. Thank you. This matters more than you think. When Harold limped away, Ethan looked at Emily. We've got scattered threads, medical testimony, instinct. Not enough to break the door down, but enough to weave into a net. Emily's reply was steady. Then let's weave fast before it's too late. Shadow barked once from inside the twins' room, startling the girls, then sat firmly at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on the bundle of clothing still folded on the chair. Ethan watched him with grim certainty. Shadow wasn't just reacting, he was pointing them toward a truth that no one wanted to see. The case was forming, ragged and fragile, but undeniable. Evidence scattered like puzzle pieces waited to be assembled, and every piece had a name. Ivy Wren, and the man who haunted the end of Maple Street. The night in Silverwood hung heavy, clouds blotting out the moon as though the sky itself wished to stay hidden from what was about to unfold. The street lamps cast pale orange pools across Maple Street, where most homes glowed warmly behind curtains. But at the far end, Gregory Hale's house loomed like a sealed tomb. Its windows dark, its walls mute and unforgiving. Ethan Walker stood by his cruiser, the breath from his lungs fogging the cold air. Beside him, Shadow paced in tight circles, tail rigid, ears erect, nostrils flaring. The shepherd's body was tense with anticipation, as though he already knew what waited behind the locked door. Emily Grant arrived, her satchel clutched against her cardigan. Face pale but resolute. "The warrant signed," she said, handing Ethan the folded papers. Her voice carried steel under the tremor. "We do this by the book. No mistakes." 2 uniformed officers followed. Officer Daniel Pierce, broad-framed with cropped, sandy hair, known for his steady calm, and Officer Lena Morales, younger, wiry, with dark eyes, sharp from years of proving herself. They checked their radios, their movements brisk but quiet. Ethan glanced at each of them, then down to Shadow. "We go slow," he instructed. "You won't expect company tonight." At his nod, Pierce rapped sharply on the door. "Silverwood Police. Mr. Hale, we have a warrant to enter." Silence. The house seemed to breathe once, then still again. Morales tried the handle, locked. With a curtain nod from Ethan, Pierce wedged the breaching tool, and with one heavy shove, the door surrendered. The foyer yawned open, too pristine. Marble tiles gleamed beneath a chandelier. Family portraits lined the walls in severe symmetry. Gregory Hale appeared at the base of the staircase, immaculate as ever in a charcoal suit despite the hour. His posture radiated control, his expression detached. "What an intrusion," he said smoothly, voice calm but edged. "May I ask what circus you bring to my home at this hour?" "You may," Ethan replied evenly, holding the warrant aloft. "Search of the premises will be thorough." Gregory's eyes narrowed, but his smile never cracked. "Of course, I have nothing to hide." Shadow tugged on the leash, nose pressing toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. His body lowered into the focused crouch of a hunter tracking scent. Ethan followed his lead, the others falling in behind. Hale trailed with a feinted air of courtesy, his polished shoes silent against the marble. Shadow halted at a locked door near the kitchen. He growled deep and rumbling, paws scratching at the wood. Ethan nodded to Morales, who produced a key from Hale's own ring with curt efficiency. The lock clicked, and the heavy door swung open to a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose up was damp and sharp, laced with chemical tang. Shadow descended first, each step deliberate, ears pinned, hackles bristled. The beam from Pice's flashlight cut into the basement, revealing what the shadows had hidden. It was not a storage cellar. In the center of the room sat a wooden chair, thick straps dangling from its arms and legs. Stains marred the wood, dark, ingrained, too deliberate to be accidents. Against one wall hung a leather strap coiled like a serpent, its end frayed from use. Beside it, a shelf of plastic containers labeled with cleaning agents, bleach, ammonia. Some were half empty, others sealed, stacked like soldiers in waiting, and on a small table pointed toward the chair rested a black camera, its red light faint but steady, recording silently. The silence broke only with Shadow's snarl. Teeth bared, body rigid as he planted himself between the officers and Gregory Hale, who had followed them down. Emily's voice cracked, but held steady. "My God, you called this a home." Gregory's tone was smooth, dismissive. "You exaggerate. This is a training setup for dogs. Discipline is vital. You can't expect obedience without consequence." Ethan's eyes burned into him. "Dogs don't sit strapped to chairs, Hale." Gregory's smile flickered for the first time, a thin veneer splintering under pressure. Linda Parker slipped through the doorway then, camera already raised. She wore her press badge prominently, her breath quick from the run down the stairs. "The Chronicle will want this," she whispered, snapping frame after frame. The flash illuminated the straps, the stains, the cold order of chemicals. "The world will want this." Hale turned sharply, his calm cracking. "You have no right." But Shadow stepped forward, lips curled, growl vibrating through the concrete. He placed his body squarely in front of the twins' clothing, folded on the chair from earlier evidence, his amber gaze unflinching. Hale froze, his hand tightening into a fist at his side. Dr. Clara Monroe entered moments later, gloves on, summoned by Ethan's request. She approached the shelves, lifting one container, unscrewing the cap, and inhaling lightly before recoiling. "These are concentrated chemical agents. Ingesting even diluted amounts would inflame and scar the digestive tract." She replaced the lid with trembling precision. "These girls' injuries weren't accidents. This proves it." Ethan turned back to Gregory. "You'll answer for this." Hale's jaw tightened. He straightened, attempting to reclaim composure. But the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. "You twist everything. You need to understand children learn only through structure. Without it, they laugh." Ethan cut in coldly. "They play, and you took that from them." He nodded to Pierce. The officer stepped forward, cuffs gleaming under the light. Hale did not resist, though his eyes burned with fury, the kind of rage born not from guilt, but from losing control. Shadow sat back, growl subsiding, but his gaze never left the man. As Hale was led up the stairs, Linda captured the moment with one last click. The evidence filled her camera roll, but more importantly, it filled the air with truth that could no longer be smothered. Clara gathered samples into sealed bags, labeling them with clinical precision. Ethan exhaled, shoulders sagging with grim relief. The house no longer seemed sterile. It seemed stripped bare, its secret cruelty dragged into the open. And though the night outside was cold, Ethan felt the first stirrings of warmth. Justice had stepped through the door. The sky over Silverwood carried the gentleness of late morning, a pale blue street with wisps of cloud. The courthouse had barely finished its first round of paperwork when a county van pulled quietly into the gated drive of Silverwood Haven, a transitional care home tucked at the town's edge. Fabric building stood warm against the frost touch. Ground, its ivy-covered walls and painted shutters, giving it a kind of weary but enduring grace. Children's laughter spilled faintly from the backyard where swings squeaked and sneakers thudded on patchy grass. Inside the van, Ivy and Wren sat side by side, their small frames rigid, hands gripping their thin knees. Their eyes scanned the building with weary silence, not daring to hope that this place could be different. The front door opened, and Margaret Ellis, the director, stepped out. She was in her late 40s, tall but slightly rounded at the shoulders, with sandy blonde hair streaked, with gray tied back neatly. Her clothes were practical, cardigans in muted colors, skirts that swayed when she walked. But her warm brown eyes carried something rarer, patience carved by years of listening. She crouched at the van's side as the door slid open. "Welcome," she said softly, voice low enough not to startle. "This is Silverwood Haven. You're safe here." Neither twin spoke. Ivy lowered her gaze while Wren tucked her face half behind her sister's shoulder. Margaret didn't press. Instead, she stepped back, giving them the space to climb down on their own. Ethan Walker was there too, Shadow at his side. The shepherd pressed forward, his great head nudging lightly at Wren's hand. She hesitated, then brushed her fingers over his fur. The gesture, tiny though it was, earned the faintest curl of a smile on Margaret's lips. Inside, the haven bustled with the rhythm of children and staff. The dining room smelled faintly of oatmeal and laundry detergent, walls decorated with crayon drawings taped in uneven rows. Margaret guided Ivy and Wren to a small room prepared just for them. 2 twin beds, quilts stitched with bright patchwork, a stuffed bear perched on one pillow. For the first day, they did little more than sit on the edge of those beds, eyes darting. Whenever footsteps echoed in the hall, meals were placed gently before them, bowls of soup, slices of bread. But the girls shrank from them, pressing their lips tight. It was Shadow who made the first breakthrough. On the second afternoon, Ethan brought him into the common room. Other children rushed forward with eager hands, but Shadow ignored the commotion and padded straight to Ivy and Wren, who sat apart in a corner. He dropped a faded red ball at their feet and lay down, chin resting between his paws, eyes fixed patiently on them. Minutes stretched. At last, Wren nudged the ball with her toe. It rolled an inch, and Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor. Ivy looked at her sister, then reached out, giving the ball a tentative push. Shadow caught it, trotted a circle, and returned it with the solemnity of a gift. The girl's lips quivered with something that looked almost like laughter. Margaret, watching from the doorway, folded her hands together. "Sometimes," she whispered to Ethan, "healing doesn't start with people at all. It starts with trust in the ones who can't lie." Ethan nodded. He knew she was right. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Shadow became familiar figures at Silverwood Haven. Ethan visited between shifts, often still in uniform, his presence steady but never imposing. Shadow would sit with the girls during meals, his head resting beside their bowls, waiting without pressure. Slowly, spoon by spoon, the girls began to eat again. Not much at first, but enough to show progress. Outside the haven's walls, the town of Silverwood roiled. Linda Parker's article had gone to press under the headline, "Invisible Chains on Maple Street." It spread like wildfire. She wrote of cruelty hidden in plain sight, of neighbors who had heard but stayed silent, of children robbed of joy until a dog's instincts dragged the truth into light. Public fury followed. In the Chronicle's office, phone lines rang non-stop. Parents, teachers, townsfolk demanding answers, demanding action. Linda worked tirelessly, her auburn hair escaping from its bun, eyes red from late nights. But her pen never slowed. Each word sharpened the outrage into purpose. At the courthouse, petitions arrived by the stack. One bore over 100 signatures. Neighbors from Maple Street, residents from across town, each name scrolled in protest. They demanded that Gregory Hale face not just arrest, but thorough investigation, that the system, which had ignored earlier warnings, not look away again. Linda herself joined the crowd that formed on the courthouse steps. One frosty morning, mothers clutched children close. Fathers held placards. Voices rose in chants that echoed against the stone. Hale's name had become a curse, his house a symbol of silence, too long endured. Back at Silverwood Haven, Ivy and Wren began toe change. They no longer clung constantly to each other. Sometimes Wren would run after the ball shadow carried across the lawn, while Ivy sat sketching at a low table with crayons. Her drawings at first were dark lines that looked like cages, figures stiff and unyielding, but gradually color seeped in. A sun in the corner, a patch of green, a dog drawn large and loyal. Margaret encouraged them with a soft hand on the shoulder, her voice always steady. "It's all right to draw the past," she told Ivy once, "but it's also all right to draw what you want tomorrow to be." Ethan watched one afternoon as the girls laughed, truly laughed for the first time since he had met them. Shadow rolled on his back. In the grass, paws in the air, tongue ling, the girls giggling as they tickled his belly. The sound was fragile, still hesitant, but it was laughter nonetheless. He looked at Margaret, who smiled knowingly. "They're beginning to believe," she said. For Ethan, the sight was enough to remind him why he wore the badge. The work was never just about catching men like Hale. It was about giving children like Ivy and Wren the chance to find their voices again. The courthouse of Silverwood stood solemn against the gray morning sky, its columns stray with age, its steps crowded with reporters, townsfolk, and neighbors who had come not out of curiosity, but out of demand for justice, for proof that their town could face its own shadows. Cameras flashed, voices mingled in low hums. But inside the chamber, silence pressed heavy as stone. Gregory Hale sat at the defendant's table, hands folded too neatly on the wood, his suit tailored Devon for this day. His face carried the same hard mask he had worn when the search team had opened his basement. The only change was in his eyes, less certain, more hollow, like glass that could shatter if pressed too firmly. His attorneys whispered frantically at his side, their legal pads littered with notes, but Hale's lips stayed thin, unreadable. Across the courtroom, screens were set up for remote testimony. Ivy and Wren appeared not in person, but through secure video link from Silverwood Haven. The girls sat together on a couch, small shoulders touching, their faces pale but steady. A child psychologist sat nearby, offering gentle reassurance, her presence a buffer against the weight of so many eyes. Judge Miriam Calder presided from the bench. She was a woman in her late 50s with short silver hair and glasses that gave her the look of a stern grandmother. Yet her voice carried warmth tempered by firmness, the kind that could comfort a child and rebuke a tyrant in the same breath. The prosecutor laid out the evidence. Medical records detailing the girl's gastrointestinal damage, rope marks, fear-based aversion to food, photographs of the basement room with his chair, straps, and chemicals, testimony from neighbors who had heard the sounds through Maple Street nights, and then the footage retrieved from Hale's hidden camera. Grainy, horrific, undeniable. The courtroom stiffened as the images flickered across the screen. Hale's facade cracked, then his jaw tightening, eyes darting once toward the exit as though the weight of exposure finally bore down. But there was no exit left. Linda Parker sat in the press row, notebook in hand. She didn't write at first. She simply watched, her chest tight with the knowledge that every word she had printed had led here. When she finally put pen to paper, the words seemed to flow without thought. Justice has arrived, not just for 2 children in Silverwood, but for every child whose silence once went unheard. Outside the chamber doors, Ethan Walker stood with Shadow. The shepherd sat tall, ears spry-cricked, tail curled neatly at his paws. He was not allowed inside, but he didn't need to be. His presence in the hallway was enough. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck, staring at the heavy oak doors, his own heart beating with the memory of Ivy and Wren's whispers. The trial stretched through the day. Hale's attorneys attempted their defense. Discipline mistaken for cruelty, evidence misconstrued, chemicals for cleanliness, but the weight of testimony crushed each claim. Clara Monroe's medical expertise, Emily Grant's social work notes, and Ethan's own sworn account painted a portrait too vivid to dismiss. By late afternoon, Thiegery filed back into the chamber. The foreman, a stout man with weathered hands, delivered the verdict with steady voice, guilty on all counts. Judge called her, nodded once, then lifted her gaze to the room. Gregory Hale, this court sentences you to 20 years in state prison for crimes of child abuse and endangerment. You will leave this room today not as a man of authority, but as a prisoner of the justice you once scorned. The gavel fell, sharp as thunder. In the video window, Ivy and Wren looked at each other. Wren reached for Ivy's hand, their fingers clasping, tightly. Neither smiled. Not yet. But the tension in their faces eased as though a shadow had finally shifted away from them. The psychologist beside them murmured something gentle. And for the first time that day, the girls exhaled without fear. Ethan closed his eyes outside the chamber door, one hand tightening on Shadow's harness. The shepherd released a low, approving huffus, if recognizing victory. Linda wrote the closing lines of her article before leaving the courtroom. The chains on Maple Street have been broken, and though justice cannot erase the scars, it can mark the end of silence. Silverwood will not forget. That evening, Silverwood. Haven was awash in golden light. The yard smelled faintly of cut grass and autumn leaves. Children played in clusters, their voices rising into the crisp air. Ivy and Wren stood uncertainly at the edge, their eyes tracking the other children, but their feet reluctant to join. Shadow trotted across the yard. A familiar red ball clamped in his jaws. He dropped it before the twins and wagged his tail once, deliberately. The girls looked at each other, then down at the ball. Wren bent, lifted it with small fingers, and tossed it a few feet. Shadow bounded after it, returned, and placed it back at Ivy's feet. A sound broke from them, then soft, tentative. Laughter, the kind that cracked like light through shutters. The ball rolled again, farther this time, and both girls ran after it, skirts flaring, hair catching the sun. Their giggles floated into the air, pure and unguarded. Ethan watched from the porch steps, Margaret Ellis beside him, his eyes glistened, his throat tight. Margaret folded her arms, a quiet smile softening her face. "You see," she said, "they're remembering how to be children." As the girls darted back, flushed and laughing, Wren slowed at Ethan's side. She looked up, hazel eyes brighter than he had ever seen them, and whispered, "We're not scared anymore. We're free now." Ethan swallowed hard, unable to speak, but Shadow pressed against his leg, tail swishing like punctuation to the truth in her words. The sun dipped lower, painting the yard in hues of amber and rose. Ivy and Wren chased the shepherd across the grass, their laughter rising, scattering into the open air. For the first time in too long, the sound was not fragile, not forced. It was whole. The story of chains and cruelty had ended. What remained was freedom, laughter, and the boundless sky above two children rediscovering their childhood. At the end of this story, let us remember that what happened in Silverwood was more than a trial, more than a rescue. It was a glimpse of the quiet miracles that God places in our lives. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a loyal dog, a steadfast officer, a compassionate neighbor, or even the courage of two frightened children who chose to whisper the truth. These are the ways God works among us, not always with thunder or fire, but with small acts of protection, justice, and love that change everything. In our everyday lives, we are given the same choice: to notice the cries that others ignore, to extend a hand where silence once reigned, and to be part of the miracle that lifts someone from fear into freedom. If this story touched your heart, share it so others may find hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe for more stories of courage and redemption. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones, and may His protection surround you.